or I have brought along something special. So if anybody asks a really good question, the something special might magically appear.
Gillian, I believe we're live right now because the recording is on. So, anytime.
Okay. In the lead up to this, someone made a comment that it would be really cool to have recipes, and not recipes, actual teaching about food. And I said, if people bring along white bread, I forgot to say white, but I meant white bread, butter, and those little fairy hundreds and thousands we call them, round sprinkles that you put on things, you can make a classic Australian dish. It's called fairy bread, which is why I think of them as fairy sprinkles. And it's something children eat at parties here. Very healthy. You butter the bread and you sprinkle it very heavily. And I didn't find pictures online because I just don't want to look at them. They make my teeth ache just looking at them. Australian food was a bit like that until the 60s. We ate English food, but not as overcooked, and we'd have salad with it. We'd have puddings. We'd eat meat every night. We're a meat-rich country. Christians would eat meat in the morning when Dad was a child. My father was a child. I'm sorry if my computer beeps at you. It's misbehaving and talking to me when it shouldn't. So think of us as a colonized country in a really classic sense. 1788 is when Europeans first settled long-term in Australia. We were one of the last continents to actually be settled by Europe. And we were settled mainly by the Brits, mainly with convicts originally. And that meant we had British food, not only British food, but one of the things about England in particular is a lot of English eaters are not very adventurous, are they? What this means is we started off eating a very narrow range of food. I brought an example, if I can find the right book. I brought something to show you. I brought a New Zealand cookbook, actually, because I couldn't find the Australian equivalent. I have a collection of cookbooks, but I can never find the ones I'm after. So this is the classic New Zealand cookbook. And New Zealand had the same thing, except they didn't get the convicts. They got settlers who had very restricted ideas about what you should eat and when. So scones and jam and cream, great. Pavlovas, lots of beef, lots of lamb, lots of eggs, lots of chicken. And those are the basic meat types. And they're still the basic meat types that you buy today, except we cooked them a bit more excitingly because after World War II, we had a big influx of people, especially from Central Europe and the Mediterranean because of World War II. So cooking, I collect charity cookbooks and cookbooks that belong to particularly community groups, and things like this started having recipes like I'm opening at random, boiled fruit health cake, which is standard, all-purpose dressing, but chili peanut dressing, which wouldn't have happened in the 40s, lamb crumble pie and lamb and apple curry. So a much wider range of food, but still all the ingredients came from Europe. Let me see if I can do the pictures to show this a bit more. And don't worry, this will amount to quite a different approach to food, but you first have to see the pictures. That's not what I want to show you. I worked this out beforehand, and do you think this is why yesterday, Nathan did all the technical stuff, because he actually could work out what to do. Okay. You're not going to see my face, but I'm just going to go through photos. So this is the sort of cooking that we do. This is me making liqueur from medlars. Now, medlars are a very European fruit. They're a cousin of quinces. My next photo is the judging at an agricultural show. Now, have a look at what they're judging. Bread, which could be anywhere in Europe, maybe not the Mediterranean. All the bread stuffs that are definitely European, except for the things down the front, which are very English. And I hope you're getting these pictures. And these are the sorts of pickles and things. This is the agricultural show, see, 2008. So we're not talking 50 years ago. We still eat primarily European food, so not as English, except we have exotic stuff like the kebab house and Oriental hot food. These are the stalls at the agricultural show. We are very international as Australia food-wise. This is a museum. It shows what we were eating in the 1920s. And if you have a look, it's Tasmanian honey, it's Billy tea, which I'll get to later if I remember, and everything else, it could be England, couldn't it? It's vinegar, it's Coleman's mustard, it's Keen's curry. It's very, very colonial. And the colonial is really important because when you look at Australia itself, this is what you're looking at. It has nothing in common with England except where we've settled it and made it so. So this is the Blue Mountains. And quite a few of things you can see in that picture are edible. But even today, most Australians will look out and not see them. I'm going to switch off. No, I'm not going to switch off the photos for a second. I'm going to switch them off because you really don't want to see all my pictures immediately. You probably do want to, but I'm not going to show you. I'm evil and nasty. So stop sharing and you can see me for a bit. So that's the background. We started off as not only English cooking, we've always been a bit more than that. We've always had much more meat and much more salad. I grew up on chops and 3 veg and salad every night, except when we had sausages and occasionally steak. And once a week we had a roast. So it was really not very exciting cooking. So what has happened? Why are we so European? And it is more European and less English than it used to be. I have a picture later on to prove this. Well, first of all, because of the way Europe colonizes the world. This is very political, and it can't be unpolitical. It's impossible for it to be unpolitical. When Europeans colonize the world, doesn't matter whether they're from England, from Poland, from Greece, they bring their favorite foods with them. They will plant the plants. These days we grow a lot more cabbage than we used to because sauerkraut is a thing that we have because we like our pickled cabbage. But we don't make sauerkraut with local ingredients, with native ingredients. We are still the colonizing country. We've been colonized in a way that will even bring in spices from near us, from Indonesia, but we didn't used to use a lot of things that were local, except that there always have been people in Australia who have used the local things, not just used the local things. There's a guy called Bruce Pascoe, and let me type you his name in the chat, who wrote a book, 2 books. They're both called Dark Emu, but they have different subtitles. And what he did with that was he looked at the writings of explorers and early settlers and looked at the way they were describing that landscape I just showed you. And it was really interesting because it shows that the Australian continent was not wilderness before Europeans came here. And we are a continent. We're not talking about one type of vegetation or one region. Rainforest up north is tropical. Around Brisbane is subtropical. Around Melbourne is temperate. They're all different types of rainforests. We have a single country with 3 types of rainforests, with about 20 types of deserts, with about 1,000 types of eucalypts. So we're a varied and strange and wonderful continent at that. So when Europe imported European things like wheat, like sheep, they changed and destroyed a lot of the landscape from before, but it wasn't a lot of it was not wild landscape before. It was farmed land, and white Australia didn't know that until recently. We knew it, but we didn't know it. It was a great denial thing. And Bruce Pascoe wrote the book that changed the way we saw everything. And suddenly people are saying, oh, this plain was not a plain that was a grass plain the way you talk about from the Americas. It was farmed land. And they're now reestablishing the plants that were farmed there, which I've never had the chance to eat because they were made nearly extinct, because the hooves of sheep are really sharp and destroy our landscape compared with, say, kangaroos. So the landscape was not only farmed, it was farmed for, we're not talking about 5,000 years of farming here. This is the other difference. Australia was settled a minimum of 60,000 years ago, and the current theory is that we were settled 120,000 years ago. So we're talking about tens of thousands of years of landscape planning, use, farming. We've got mapping. My glass of water today is actually a water map for a region. So what we thought of as primitive art turned out to be advanced maps. This is another map. They're in mugs because I couldn't find the other ones. So you had a system of art, and this is from the Northern Territory and from the Great Desert area. There's a whole region which is the equivalent, probably in size of bigger than Poland, that has a particular style of art, and they use the art to create water maps and food maps, so you know where to go and what to do. You weren't going to, it's hugely hot there, and they made sure people had enough to drink by having a map system that was also art. And the rest of the world thought, this is cool, this is primitive, this is weird, and this is the past. And they didn't realize just how big and important it was until quite recently. And now people are actually talking to the custodians of the land. So I'm on Ngunnawal country, and I will write that because it's one of these impossible things. Ngunnawal country is actually Canberra, but I'm on the edge of Wiradjuri. So we know what land we're on now, and we're beginning to learn the sorts of things that were farmed here. So once a year there was a major meetup in the mountains, near the mountains I'm in, and people would all the different, the Wiradjuri and Ngunnawal would meet. It would be neutral ground, and they would eat bogong moths. And when I first moved to Canberra 30 years ago, everyone told me that they would just eat the bogong moths and maybe toast them. Turns out there are half a dozen ways of cooking bogong moths. They're big moths. They're like that big, and they're really annoying. One year they covered Parliament House because this is the fly-through zone for them. That's why the meetup was there, and I've never had the courage. I've cooked bogong moths by mistake when they've flown into my grill, but I've never had the courage to actually eat them. Apparently they're nutty and really nice, and they've got this good nutty texture, so you can actually bake with them. But we didn't ask, white Australia didn't ask what people did with things. They just assumed it was primitive. 20 years ago, I went to the Melbourne Museum, and the food examples in one part of them, most of the museum were things like the wedding cake from Neighbours, or what people put in a school lunchbox in the 60s. For the Indigenous Australia part of the museum, it was a bunch of plants with no indication of how they were harvested, no indication of how they were cooked, just the assumption that the people used them were primitive. And these were people who had developed cooking techniques and farming techniques and some amazing engineering for making sure they had heaps of food all year, and plant cultivation that actually changed the plants to make them fit, just like we did with wheat, make them fit everyone's needs more. And they've been doing this for at least 60,000 years. It's been slow, it's been incremental, and it's been consistent. So it's a real insult to some very old cultures to say, oh, you just ate plants, because we just eat plants and animals too. And you could ignore the fact that we cook them, but Australians did, and we still do to a large extent. It's getting better. So I know some of it, but not a great deal. What do I know? I've got this big question to say, what's missing? And what was missing and what's still missing is the realisation that Australia was one of the first land masses settled out of Africa, and that the people who settled it were intelligent and really clever, because how do you live in a tough environment? You change the environment. You make it work for you. And that's what we did, and that's what we did as in human beings. And that's what people still do. But we're having to relearn all that. We've got a really bad reputation for climate change, we as in mainstream Australia, but we were the first country to, non-mainstream Australia, to sort out climate change, to sort out the climate, to sort out the land, and to use it sensibly, cleverly, which makes it very interesting and different is probably what I'm thinking. There are a bunch of prejudices in there. There are a bunch of ways that Australia as a whole uses the racism that most of the rest of the world shares and says that people who don't have the same style of culture as us must be primitive. And so you don't look and say, what's happening here? So what's happening with Edible Australia is we have thousands of edible things that we don't know how to cook, that we don't use, and that now many of them are protected because the whole world knows that Australia is unique, and people say you cannot cook with this thing because it's unique. So PETA, the US left-wing group that tries to save everything, tells Australians we cannot eat kangaroos because they're only found in Australia. The fact that there are 18 million red kangaroos in Australia means they're not a threatened species, but that adds to the pressure to not eat the stuff that's common, that's around us. So this means most Australians, including a lot of Indigenous Australians these days, don't have the skills to interpret the landscape. Let me see if I can get you more pictures and talk you through them. Maybe I will actually get this sorted. Okay, that's very exciting. Okay, this is where we left off. I hope you can see it. You can all see it. So that's in the Blue Mountains. This is in Sydney. This is in the middle of a big city. This is the Parramatta River, and you can still see the mangroves. You can still see. This was one of the richest parts of Australia and was white settled first, almost first, and changed very early on, completely changed by 1808. So the only thing that is familiar is that little bit of foreshore along the river. And no, the mangroves aren't it. And this is the picture I was thinking of. This is a family recipe, which is chicken soup with matzo balls. And that's not a single thing in that recipe is Indigenous to the country that I live in, but my family has made it since the 1850s. So the photos aren't in order because I couldn't work out how to do that. This is a native plant. It's called Melaleuca alternifolia. It's also called tea tree. So when the British first settled here, not everything was accessible. England was 3 months away on a normal trip. It could be as little as 10 weeks if you travel quickly. It was a long way away. So getting tea in the first 20, 30 years was almost impossible, and even up to 60 or 70 years. So the early settlers looked at plants and said, well, what tastes like? And this tastes a little like tea, the leaf. The flowers are really pretty. It's common as muck. You can just pick it any time. And it tastes like a kind of a spicy tea, and we don't drink it anymore. We call it tea tree, but we don't drink it anymore. But it was our tea replacement. There's a joke, not about this bird. I just like this bird because this was outside my back door. These local birds we don't eat mostly. We eat some. We look at them and think, oh, they're just birds. We don't think of bird life as edible. So that's a crimson rosella. It's perfectly edible, but I don't know anyone who's ever tried one. I know we complain about them because they're common, but they're pretty. This is what the European settlement did to the landscape. This is about 2.5 hours from me. You can see what sheep did, and cows with lovely European hooves. And this is a gum tree. In Europe, I've seen gum trees, but they don't have as many young leaves as this, so the leaves become longer as they get older. What you do is you make billy tea. I said I was going to talk about billy tea. So this is something that has been done for at least 100 years, maybe even 160 years, actually. I'm thinking back. in Australia, you take a leaf from the tree, from one of those trees, and you put it in the water and tea, and you boil it in a tin can and shake it around. And it's a cool thing I used to do when I was a kid. You take this tin of boiling water with tea leaves and maybe a eucalypt leaf in, and you'd settle the leaf by swinging the billy in like one of those carnival amusement park Ferris wheels. And it's quite dangerous if you don't know what you're doing, but we all knew no one ever got burned. But that's and when that flavour became too strong because it became unfashionable to have billy tea, you'd either buy it commercial with a little bit of eucalyptus taste, or you'd put the eucalyptus leaf on the fire you were heating up the water in and get the scent that way. And that's the only food use we made of the most common tree in Australia when I was a child. The only one. This is another plant that was used for, it's actually used as a herb now for people who know what it is, which is not a lot. It's Prostanthera. Its common name is native mint. So it's not related to the mint plant at all, but it tastes like a mint with a little bit of eucalyptus in it. And it's really beautiful. It makes the best herb tea, but you have to know how to use it. And most people will have this in their garden and have no idea. This is a very ordinary seaside picture. There are 3 plants in there that are edible. I cannot locate them from the picture. I took it in the middle of a discussion about edible Australia with someone a few years ago, and one of the plants is pig face, and I've never seen it ripe enough to eat. And another one is egg and bacon bush, and again, I've never eaten it. I don't remember the third, so I can't identify. I bet you it's saltbush. I can't identify them for you, and I'm better than most at identifying edible plants. I'm not an expert. I'm just happen to be interested. This is another picture where you've got 2 edible plants, which I can't identify. The fact that one of them I can. There's a tea tree there. It doesn't have flowers on it. So maybe there are 3. And then you can see that there's a willow there as well, and rushes, because we plant European stuff over the landscape. That is not edible. Well, it is edible, but wouldn't be eaten. But I didn't have a picture of a goanna. So early settlement and before white settlement, goannas were much eaten, and still today there are people who eat goannas. Goannas are 6-foot lizards. That is not a goanna. That's actually a water dragon, and it's adolescent. It's not fully grown. And it posed for me, so I got a really good picture. That's the only really good picture of a lizard I could find for you. So no, you don't eat water dragons. They don't have enough meat. You eat goannas, which will feed about 30 people. This is edible. This is something you can buy mostly as dog food, but you can buy kangaroo steaks these days and cook with them. Kangaroo is gamey, it's lean, it's very good for you, and it makes everybody out of Australia feel really bad when you say, yes, we eat skippy. The French, anybody French will be really angry with me for eating skippy, but since early colonial days, we've had recipes for kangaroo tail soup. It was the cheap meat for the people who didn't have any money. And more recently, it's a trendy meat. So it's one of the few parts of Australia that's actually been edible. Koalas are not, but it's a really good picture of a koala with a gum tree. And I thought you needed to see a picture of a koala for Australia. That's an adolescent koala. It was posing for me, so I got it. But it's at a Tidbinbilla, a nature reserve. It wasn't. It's very hard to see koalas in the wild. They don't pose for you like this would. This one likes people. These are edible, and we only know they're edible. We do not eat them because we're told you have to protect native birds. I know they're edible because in Europe, in the Middle Ages, people ate swans. So I know how to cook swans, but I'm really careful around swans because black swans have worse tempers than European swans. So you can get pictures of them, but you can even go close, but you have to be prepared to being snapped at. That's a bush turkey. Bush turkey is eaten, was eaten. I just like that bush turkey. They're the most beautiful coloured birds. But the reason they're not eaten much at all today is they're protected. And this is true of a lot of Australian birds and animals. We don't eat them not because they're not edible. Bush turkey apparently tastes like halfway between chicken and pheasant. And if you serve it to someone and say it's pheasant, they will not say, oh, you're wrong. And they're very pretty birds, and they've got different coloured bills, and they're exciting, and they're a great nuisance, and people hate them. But we're not allowed to kill them or eat them because Australia has a unique environment, and we really don't take very good care of it. And the we in this case is very much white Australia. And the last picture for you is more kangaroos. And that's just kangaroos in a park with a road behind it. Kangaroos are common as muck where I am. They're not as common in the rest of Australia. Well, the rest of Australia. They're very common in the whole of Australia, except in most cities. I'm in the only city that has kangaroos. And now I can see all of your questions. So Kodama, it's more than forgetting our heritage. This is part of the 19th century idea that Indigenous peoples had to die natural deaths. There's a lot of really nasty politics that goes alongside the forgetting what things are outside. It's including taking children away and just destroying cultures. There's a lot more politics here. Poland has been advantaged and disadvantaged by all the wars happening where you are, by you being a place where people hurt each other and invade and stuff, because it means you've had to use all the foodstuffs around you. Australia, since colonisation, in fact, Australia's always been a rich country food-wise. It's just that we don't use all the richness. And and yes, Tina, I totally agree. There are millions of kangaroos. Why not eat some? At the same time, I say, but they're cute. And this is where I tell you the story of a kangaroo that wasn't cute but has a food story. It's definitely a food story. So I did the banquet designs, the feast designs for Conflux, the Canberra Science Fiction Convention, for some years because people wanted historical themes and fantasy banquets and science fictional banquets. So it was always a proper chef at a hotel who did the cooking. I did the design and fandom tested all the recipes for me, and we had a lot of fun. So 2 years running, there was a Swiss chef. His name was Beat Etlin. And one year, whenever I had a meeting with him, he'd wear his chef's hat and look very, very dignified. And one year, this is a bit difficult to explain. One year I was embarrassed to meet him. That's the best way of saying it. He was there and perfectly normal and very calm and placid. But a few days before, there's a newspaper article about him. What had happened was he was on a reserve in Canberra. There are a lot of kangaroos around here. They are common roadkill here. So before you argue about whether or not we should eat kangaroos, they will not stay off the roads because they go everywhere. Cars do not see them. They get killed. A lot of the roo meat that we eat is not farmed. It's keeping the kangaroo population down so they don't suffer unduly. It's really complicated. And it's not a matter of whether we should or we shouldn't. It's a matter of how we should, what we should do with populations that are getting damaged. And everybody argues about this all the time. So whatever opinion you have in the chat, someone will have it in Australia. So Beat had a huge fence, a 3-metre fence, keeping between his place and the reserve because there were lots of kangaroos on it. That's quite normal in that part of Canberra. A 6-foot red kangaroo jumped over the 3-metre fence, got into his house, explored the house a bit. Everybody was asleep. His 12-year-old boys bedroom door was a little bit open. The kangaroo came into the 12-year-old's room, and this poor boy woke up with a 6-foot red kangaroo looking over it. He screamed, raced out of bed only in his underwear, went into his boy's room and wrestled the kangaroo outside. And that made front page news. Swiss chef in underwear wrestles red kangaroo. So it's really...
I have to ask, how often do people in Australia actually have to wrestle the kangaroos? Because for me, it's something like straight from a joke,
Not very often. This is the only time that's happened to anyone I know. Kangaroos, I think my worst kangaroo experience would be when I was walking to see some rock paintings. It was about a 2-mile walk, 2-and-a-bit-kilometre walk. And we went through a valley which was previously farmed, and there were old plants everywhere, like roses that had gone wild and turned to briar. And so I was watching carefully, and then my mother was with me. She and my stepfather were visiting. This was about 20 years ago. And she said, "You better not talk to us for a bit." And I looked around, and there were 80 kangaroos, or nearly at two full herds. And they were like this, and they were all looking. And as we moved, their eyes moved in unison. And that's a more common experience with kangaroos. The wrestling thing is mostly American movies, but you do not approach wild kangaroos. You do not talk to them. You do not feed them food. The only kangaroos you come close to are ones that have been trained to deal with humans safely, because they can kick. They can actually kill you. That's for real. So no, we don't talk to kangaroos every day. It's not safe, but we see them a lot.
I have another question, if I may.
Yes, of course.
Because if we talk about one phenomenon, which is wrestling the kangaroos, I also want to ask about the famous emu war.
The emu war?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, let me show you.
Are they edible?
First of all, emus are very edible. They are one of the best meats you'll ever have. Emu prosciutto wrapped around fig is one of the best things ever. And I can't get it very often because the only place that makes it is the other end of Canberra to me. So emu meat is very lean, a bit wild, but really, really good and tender, and they make amazing kebabs. It's actually hard to get hold of because we don't do much farming of our wild animals. Emu oil, however, and emu eggs and emu feathers are very easy to get hold of. I use emu oil is one of these magic things that really, really helps some people who have rheumatoid arthritis. I have it, and the reason I'm able to move my hands these days is because of emu oil. Emu eggs, here's one. Let me put it to the face. This is how big they are. And they do look a little bit like avocados, but that's not avocado. That's an emu egg. I just tapped it for you. That's the special thing. I was waiting for someone to mention emus. You can't buy emu eggs to eat because the market for shells in America in particular is so big that these shells will cost between $9 and $25 because of the market. It's not so tiny. I have quite big hands. It's not as big as an ostrich egg, but it's quite big. And emus are quite big, and they are not nice to be around. When I was a child, they used to stalk us at wildlife places. We went to the country any time and you came across emus, you stay clear of them, not because they'll attack you, but because they'll take all your food. They especially like taking children's food because and if you have 20 or 30 emus, once when we were driving somewhere, we had to stop because the emus got so curious. They all descended on the car and stood in front of it looking at us. This isn't every day, but it does happen. The emus stealing your food happens even more. So emus may not be as big as ostriches, but they're actually much more savvy. Australia lost the emu war. Our Western Australia military people lost to a bunch of emus. That's how clever they are. We had a bushranger who rode an ostrich and wore lots of jewellery. So ostriches have been imported here as well, but emus are the native bird, and they're different. They're super bright. They will interrogate you with their eyes, but they have beautiful meat. And I have eaten it. I'm speaking from experience. I haven't eaten it often. It's quite hard to get hold of. And I'm just looking at my amazing notes. See, I wrote notes tonight.
Okay, I do have a question. You've mentioned mostly very uncommon sources of food nowadays, but what of the say foods native to Australia that are very hard to get people's hands on elsewhere, like say finger limes or stuff like this?
I love finger limes. Whenever anybody grows finger limes, I keep on dropping hints at them that I need them because I live in a flat. And so what I prepared something earlier for you all. A couple of places with recipes online, and also the places you can buy them. So if you click on any of those sites, I can talk you through. So what we've had in the last 20 years, two things: food tourism, where people will actually come to taste the stuff that's unique to Australia, and secondly, an active effort to market Australian stuff. There is stuff that has been marketed before then, but it's been attributed to other countries. So macadamias are native to Australia. But America moved them to Hawaii and says, hey, it's all American. Cashews are also native to Australia. So if anybody clicks on any of the links I've given you, you'll get pretty pictures, but B, I'm happy to talk you through the ingredients we actually use and how we use them. So there are half a dozen herbs and spices which are dead common now, which lemon myrtle, which is the best lemon flavour you'll get from any herb. It's beautiful. It's the purest lemon with no acid. And I'm happy to talk you through any of them, and you get to admire the pictures. I haven't tasted everything that's around at the moment because in the last year, a whole bunch of new things have become available. So Australia's working very hard at saying, we have to change this ignoring of everything around us. We have to use some of these ingredients and respect the land we live on, rather than turning into a mini Europe. But we're talking about maybe 30 ingredients of maybe 2,000 possible. So we're not there yet.
I had no idea that tamarind was native to Australia, actually.
It's
used in Asian cuisines, but yeah.
Northern Australia is on the equator and a boat ride from Indonesia. So anything that you find in the southern parts of Indonesia grows in Northern Australia. Pepperberries are native to Australia. They look like, I have some, but finding them would take about 5 minutes. They look like berries, but black. And when you pound them or grind them, but pounding is better than grinding because they're soft, they have a beautiful, rich pepper flavour, but they turn your food purple, which is gorgeous. It's just really fun. So I cook a lot with pepperberry because they've got a rounder flavour, a richer flavour than any other pepper. And because it's just really fun to watch people's faces when they see things turned purple. Thank you for the picture, Mal. So pepperberries are common now, and they're grown in, most of the pepper from Tasmania is pepper leaf, and pepperberry is mostly commercially in northern New South Wales or southern Queensland. What that means, it's subtropical rainforests. So it would be difficult to grow in Europe, which means it's a really good one to say, yes, this is Australian. So anything from the far south is from a European climate, so Tasmania or the Melbourne area. A warm European climate in summer, but it's still a European climate. And which means anything that's native there could be grown in Europe. But anything that's from Sydney and further north is going to be difficult to grow in Europe.
I have another question, because we talked about land animals and we talked about plants, and it just occurred to me we didn't talk about fish or any seafood.
Okay, the reason I don't automatically bring up fish and seafood is I'm actually allergic to it, so I can't tell you what it tastes like. I can tell you that we have some very famous ones. So barramundi is the most famous Australian fish, and people swear by it, and tourists always want to eat it and go away saying, I want barramundi. We have Pacific oysters, which are different to the oysters you have. We have abalones and all sorts of shellfish. And there are middens. From when I was a child, we used to explore the coast a lot because my mother was a geology teacher. And so I learned to identify middens. And so there are middens that go back 15,000 years that have things like limpets. So there are a lot of varieties of shellfish here. Some of the varieties are similar to varieties that you get in the Pacific elsewhere, but others aren't. So we have some unique and some shared because the ocean's more shared. And our seaweed, the seaweed we buy is most of the types that have been used in Japan or Korea, because that's where our influence for seaweed comes from. It means we don't know our own seaweed very well. And thank you. I'm glad somebody's eaten barramundi. One bite of it and I would be dead, so I'm never going to be able to. But it's got a great reputation. And so has Australia tuna. And there are a lot of Australian fish that have been nearly farmed out by international fisheries. Whaling was a big thing in Australia in the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century. It's one of the reasons Tasmania was solidly settled. It was a set of whaling stations at one stage, which means all the things that other people eat that land on Australian shores, we have also eaten. We've been much less restrictive in the way we choose things when they come from the sea. So you can get sea urchins at gourmet restaurants in Sydney, for instance. And all the things that are popular in Japan, that because we have sea in common with Japan, sort of, are common here because we get a lot of Japanese tourists. And so the tourist industry, food tourism, is really important to growing what we eat from our own local environment. So yeah, you're more likely to see local fish than you are to see local land animals. But I can't tell you what they taste like. And we don't always give them the right names. That things get hidden. No one wants to say, I ate shark, so they say, I ate flake. I like questions. I have more URLs for you, I think, if you're really unlucky. Let me have a look. Have I given you everything? Oh, I've got some regional differences, and if you want to know how bush tucker, we call it bush tucker became acceptable to mainstream Australia, I've got some URLs with some of the stages we've gone through, and I can talk you through them if you want to know the path that it took. But the regional differences, there's not a lot on the web. We have more regional differences than you can shake a fist at, because we're such a big country with so many different areas, but we don't have the exploration of the food side of it on the web at the moment. It's more for people in the know. So people in the know include, and I found you an example of that too, grey nomads. Grey nomads, a lot of people when they retire become grey nomads. My mother and stepfather did it for 5 years. They pack everything up and live in a camper van and wander around for a while. My parents actually went all the way around Highway Number 1, which is the whole of mainland Australia, and it took them 3 years because it's a lot of highway, and that's quite a common thing. So that's the sort of website that you can find information about local foods from, because these are the people who were doing the exploring prior to COVID. I wouldn't mind doing it as a retirement plan, but I can't drive and no one's going to drive me all around the country. But it's a lovely thing. You get to see all sorts of things, everything from rocket bases to rainforests. I don't know why I'm so fixated on rainforests at the moment. I think I just miss it. Any other thoughts, questions? Do you want to know more about how bush tucker became acceptable? Because it's a really interesting story, how we started to actually see our landscape again as full of edible things.
I would be interested, yes.
Okay. There was this guy called Les Hiddens, and I've given you his site, and he called himself the Bush Tucker Man. And he was one of these people who did survival stuff. So he took survival stuff and made a TV show out of it. They're called Bush Tucker Man, and he still does this kind of thing, and there's a website for him. And that reminded everybody that it was okay to be white Australia and eat local stuff, and people got interested in it. And more recently, people are just discovering we're a very foodie country. And so that started 30 years ago, 40 years ago is when it began, and now it's a part of our culture again. Natalia, I have not talked about how I use specific plants and animals in my worlds, but that's actually kind of important. Most Australian writers don't and can't, because editors will say no one knows what this is. You've got to use sheep. You can't use potoroos. Most people outside Australia have no idea what a bandicoot is, what a potoroo is, they might know echidna, they might know platypus, but we don't eat platypus, we don't eat an echidna. So we don't use a lot of our own animals because they're already exotic. And so if you use them in worlds, they need footnotes. And I'm determined to break that one day. So I use them in my novels set in Australia, but I don't use them in created worlds. Is this a potoroo? Let me find out. I think that's a quokka. It might be a potoroo. They can look. The problem is depends on the angle you take them from. And I haven't seen potoroos from that angle. I've only seen them from above. But quokkas are much more performative. Oh, good. We have quokkas. Potoroos, sorry. I say one thing. Yes, that's a potoroo. That's what I know as potoroos. I love the little begging hands. Potoroos actually look they're perfectly safe and charming, but they look quite evil. It's interesting. There are a lot of cute Australian animals. It is worth coming and going to the nature reserves where you can see them safely for them and just observing all the cuteness. Actually, no, potoroos are not deadly. Potoroos are plant-eating or insect-eating and perfectly safe. Only a very few of our animals are deadly. There are snakes, but not all snakes are. The deadly thing comes from America wanting to label us as the deadly continent. We are a whole continent. On this continent, we have of the top 10 poisonous spiders and poisonous snakes. We have several of the top 10 in both categories. But you don't see them every day, and you learn to spot them, and you don't walk into long grass without stamping your feet and having covered up legs and they don't want to. There's only one snake that will attack and one spider that will attack, and you learn to identify them. In other words, in any country, there's stuff that's not safe. We might be only a country, but we're a country that's a whole continent with a whole continent worth of different things. So proportionately speaking, only that much is actually dangerous. What's more dangerous is our summer, especially in the red centre, where it can reach 53 degrees. You do not go out in Australia in summer without water and without a mobile phone so you can get to safety, so that you don't die of dehydration. that's a much bigger killer than all the things that tourists claim might be killing them. So yeah, I got really shocked when I discovered that there were still aurochs and bears. In Europe has bears. That's scary because, they're deadly. Okay, only very northern Europe has bears, but still.
Actually cows are much more deadly than bears.
And that's the thing.
Yeah.
It's not what I feel that bears are deadly because I don't know bears. People feel that Australia's stuff is deadly because they don't know Australia's stuff. And there's a mystique about Australia. We are the different continent. And so if we're different, it must be dangerous. And emus can be dangerous if you're eating chips and you've got the packet open and they see them and think, oh, I can eat those. Magpies, male magpies, swoop and attack you in spring. But we're not the country that wrote the birds, the continent that had the story of the birds. That was Daphne du Maurier in England, which has to be one of the safest places on the planet. And Christina, we don't have much air pollution. We did for the bushfires, and Sydney is not that wonderful, but I can look it up and tell you what the air pollution is outside now, where I am. Let me look it up because I think that would be fun. The air pollution in Canberra at this very minute is the map's not coming up quickly. Oh, it's really bad. It is bad for here. It's 18. So when we had the bushfires, the worst it got was 11,000, which was scary bad. It was actually, you can't breathe it without, people did die of it. But that was the first time ever. So the air here is normally about 5 in pollution count, which is pretty pure. And we are a city. This is not country. I live in a flat in a city. So the native, thank you, Alia. The names are, this is a thing we do with birds, with plants, with everything, is to name them after their European equivalent. This is part of the way Australia works. It wasn't out of nostalgia. It was because we had no way, European Australia had no way of describing them. So they were technical. Prostanthera, great. But Prostanthera didn't tell you how you could use it. So if something tastes a bit like mint, you call it native mint, and that's Prostanthera. Some of them are really similar to the original. So pepperberry is a very peppery plant. Some of them are hardly similar at all. Native parsley has nothing in common with parsley, and is indeed the most horrible herb I've found. I don't like it. Indigenous names I used. Quandong is an Indigenous name. It's also called native peach, but Quandong is the name that has taken. And so there's no rule for it. It depends on when something was discovered by English-speaking Australia and who did the discovery and how it was marketed and a whole bunch of things like that. Anything that's citron is always called by a citron-type name, so finger limes. Finger limes vary incredibly in flavour, but they're all amazing. And they're local to me, but I don't have a tree, and the markets don't have them. So I'm always asking people when they're in season, do you have any to spare? And sometimes I get them. So finger limes are basically the caviar of the citrus world. They can be used in any kind of dish, and they're rather amazing. What about plants? Some plants take over. Grasses can be a real problem. European weeds take over, daisies and stuff. But not just European. There was an actual effort to introduce South African plants in lots of southeastern Australia because it's suitable to the environment. And so anything that's introduced as garden plants can invade the wilderness. So we spend a lot of work in national parks pulling things up and trying to get them under control. It's a big thing here. And it's a big volunteer thing here. If you move to Australia, you can spend all your weekend reclaiming parkland for native plants. We try to do that very much. In food terms, because we're one of the world's main food suppliers, we were one of the few countries that had no trouble with food last year. In fact, we had 70% of our food we had no idea what to do with because we couldn't export it the usual way. And that most of the vast bulk of that food is introduced plants and animals. Lamb, so sheep are not native to Australia, cows are not native to Australia, wine grapes are not native to Australia. North America has an indigenous grape, which is the Concord. Australia doesn't. So every single bottle of Australian wine you drink, and we do make very nice wine, is from an introduced plant. And we had the same problem with, in Europe, at some stage, most of your grape harvests were problematic because of a crisis. The plants all died. We had the same problem. It came out here as well. So we had a great wine industry in the late 19th century. Then it had to be started up again in the 20th, just like Europe. So because we're closely connected to Europe, especially Western Europe, there are a lot of agricultural patterns in common. We have oranges as good as Spain, and we have cherries as good as America. They're all imported plants originally, but they've been part of our food industry for over 100 years, and we are one of the few agricultural nations in the top 10 wealthy countries. We have agriculture, and we have lots of digging up things from the ground, and I don't know what we're going to do without the coal and gas, but it will improve the world. So we're not going to be one of the world's wealthy countries for much longer, but we're very much part of the global economy because we have European ingredients for things. Any other? I'm happy to.
We formally have 5 minutes to end, so if anyone has any questions, you can unmute your mics or you can use the chat as we did. Please ask whatever you want to know.
Okay, so it's maybe a little bit outside of the topic, but I really have to ask this. Is Vegemite really popular with the people?
Yes, Vegemite is lovely, but Australia has a national sense of humour. So when tourists come and want to try Vegemite, we tell them that you have to spread it really thick like jam, but we eat it spread really thin with lots of butter and just a little bit of Vegemite, and that's really nice. But it's really horrible if it's too thick. So we'll tell people, because especially Americans believe everything we say, because we're such a sober-looking country. We say, oh yes, you eat it like chocolate spread. You take just spoons out of the jar. Yes, we also talk about drop bears. We have a lot of jokes that we will inflict on tourists, and they're not as obvious as some countries. So drop bears are koala. Technically, you can look them up on museum pages, and there'll be actual classification pages for them, but they're a fiction used to terrify American tourists. And Vegemite eaten with a spoon out of the jar, no, because it tastes really horrible if you eat a lot. But it's absolutely delightful if you have the right amount on buttered toast.
Oh yeah, I quite like it, but I've never thought of putting butter on it.
The buttered makes it really nice, and some people have it with cheddar cheese. So you have butter, Vegemite, and then cheese on top. And the makers of Vegemite liked that thought so much they actually marketed it for a while. But people like choosing the cheese, so it didn't work that well. I'm happy to take random questions about Australian food or our sense of humour or our bizarreness in general. We're a bit of it when we're unique. I think that's the best way of saying it.
Yes, you are. You're flavoring tuna, as I remember.
We do things differently. Oh, surely other countries flavor tuna.
Okay, I have another question.
If you say so.
Okay, so within the last 20 years, like cooking shows like MasterChef became popular. Do you have any idea how the cooking and foodstuffs were impacted by, say, MasterChef Australia or shows like some such?
Okay, we've had food shows since the beginning of television, not quite the beginning, almost the beginning of television in Australia. We've had celebrity chefs. We are a very, very foodie country. We now have one of the great international cuisines, largely because we're so foodie. So our master chef was a bit different to the earlier master chefs from other countries because food brings us together. So our master chef was more convivial, unless it was COVID was awful for MasterChef because the contestants couldn't hug each other. And I discovered at that moment that in other countries, contestants actually are trying to beat each other, not become best friends. So it's a different approach to food here. It is very competitive. We do want our Michelin stars and all the rest of it. But there's also a conviviality to it, and people who can cook are popular. My sister's a wine expert, and she's very popular. If we have one more question, and then I'm happy to move to Discord if people still want to ask things or chat. No more questions. Thank you, everybody. That was a lot of fun for me. I hope it was good for you. I hope it took you out of Poland for an hour and gave you the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Gillian, and we'll be delighted if you could join us on Discord server.
I will do this. I'll see you in about 2 minutes.
See you, everyone.
Bye.